Thanks very much, and thanks for the invite to come and talk here in this stupendous room. It's, I think, the most extraordinary place I've had the pleasure of talking, so that's very exciting. Also, it's a sunny day, and those from the UK will know it's been raining continually for 8 months, and so it's nice to be somewhere sunny, and I feel optimistic as a result. My answer to the question, I'll give you my bottom line up front, which is that I'm not sure, and I'm a little uncertain. And I was quite frustrated when I got the question directed to me because I wasn't sure how to address it. But I think it's a useful contextual point for my own thinking about AI, and perhaps also for others. There's a lot of dogmatic certainty in opinions that are expressed, and I've heard a great deal of stridency here. And it's always good, I think, to keep in mind that some things are not settled, some things are hard to grasp, and to get to, and certainly that's how I feel. I want to think a little bit critically with 3 factors, and then give you a final thought to think about where I ended up. Firstly, I think the idea that autonomous weapons will make the world more dangerous because they'll make it like killing on a screen, dehumanizing conflict, has a rich tradition. You go back to SLA Marshall or David Grossman in his book on killing. The idea is that as you increase what's called the killing distance, the distance away from, from the actual destruction, you make it psychologically easier to kill. And autonomous weapons are sometimes seen in that particular context. But I would say to that, it's not necessarily so. As we know in living memory, one of the largest genocides in human history was carried out with agricultural instruments at close range in 1994. So increasing the killing distance isn't the only factor in play. Conversely, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, even with high technology systems capable of killing at great range and at great scale, crisis was averted through a process of empathy and shared understanding between Khrushchev and Kennedy. So the argument that increasing the range or the technological sophistication in play necessarily results in it being easier to kill is, I think, problematic. A second argument here that's sometimes made is that in depopulating the battlefield of combatants, you make it easier for the sides with the autonomous weapons to consider the use of force. And again, here's something that sounds intuitively possible, but there's a big assumption here that the enemy doesn't necessarily get a vote. And the point from Clausewitz that came to my mind was that once war starts, you don't necessarily know how it's going to shape up. So you might start the war with that assumption and then find violence has revisited you in turn. There's also, I think, a connection, certainly in my part of the world, between technological innovation, liberalism, and I would venture a degree of risk aversion. Many of the societies that have developed these innovative, precise weapon systems have done so in the context of a liberal aversion to risk for their own combatants, but also in more general terms in the context of war. So that's another factor in play. And then the final reason for my own skepticism in addressing this question is the concept of disproportionate killing, that autonomous weapons might somehow encourage sides to engage in greater violence than they would otherwise consider possible. And I think this has been much in popular discussion or in the news recently in the context of the Israel-Gaza conflict and the systems known as Lavender and Gideon, and the idea that in using autonomous targeting systems, you increase the number of civilians who are potentially killed. Again, something that's intuitively plausible, but for me anyway, slightly problematic if you scratch the surface. What happens, or what seems to have happened, is that the rules of engagement are set by humans, and the side setting those rules of engagement factors in a degree of civilian risk into its targeting assessments. That's a human decision, not a machine decision. What the machine does is allow an increase in the tempo of operations, and so the aggregate number of deaths is larger than it would be if the targeting was done by traditional methods. So again, keep in mind the perils of what scholars call technological determinism. Those risk parameters were set by humans, not by machines. and that's something I keep in mind. So it's worth thinking critically, I think, about that question. But I do want to end with a final point that I guess I would say causes me alarm when I'm thinking about autonomous weapons systems in this context. And it's this, it's again what Clausewitz would call the uncertain grammar of these weapon systems. We have, particularly in the context of escalation, we have a reasonably good idea of how humans think about risk and escalation when they're squaring off against other humans. We have a less clear idea of how machines think about risk and escalation when they're squaring off against other humans or against other machines in particular, or most realistically against human-machine teams. But what we do know from early experimental work in this area is that it looks a bit different and that machines can escalate in ways that humans find surprising. And perhaps I think that, along with arms racing, is the greatest risk here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kmentt. And for sure, the humanization of warfare can lower the threshold for conflict. This is a good segue to our next speaker. Welcome, Patricia. If you project to the future, what challenges of conflict escalation, arm races, and non-proliferation do you see? Is attribution also as a challenge?
Thank you so much. And I'm going to riff a little bit off Ken, and I'm going to think a little bit historically. So in my analysis, I think we've had since 1945 two major transitions in the whole concept of war. One of those is the invention of weapons that could completely destroy our species, in which I will put nuclear weapons and biological weapons in that category. The other is lethal technologies that are, in which the perpetrator doesn't suffer immediate effect and are increasingly autonomous, where the autonomy is non-linear and not fully understood in the moment, and the changing speed, the speed of decision-making is such that the human gets in the way, right? So that's really, this is the transition we're in at the moment. And we're calling them AWS or LAWS. They may get called something else in the future. And I would like to call them weapons without mercy, because I think this is where they are. They're weapons that, they do all the things that weapons could do, but they make decisions without the human factor. So I am reluctant, however, to give an untrammeled Orwellian version of the future, a dystopian future of arms races and perpetual war and autonomous weapons systems in all domains with humans under the control of the limits of machines. And the reason is, I think that humans are very reluctant, at least in my experience of humans, to relinquish control anywhere. Right? We really hate it. It's one of the reasons why we all hate getting on an airplane or having someone else drive. Right? And history teaches us that we have suffered a lot of near misses, particularly when it comes to nuclear weapons. So we're already very concerned about this, which means we're turning our attention. And I think as we've seen, for example, with nuclear weapons, with biological weapons, with the use of force in counterterrorism, for example, with human cloning and so on, we are already turning to think about how we might regulate at the same time to keep the benefits of AI. And I turned to the November summit in Bletchley last year in the UK. And there was a long statement from 28 states plus the EU, I think, in which essentially what they affirm, and they use the word affirm, which is interesting, urgency and resolve to work together to ensure human-centric, trustworthy, responsible, safe AI through all existing international fora and all relevant initiatives. And to me, that was a really important statement. And I think that we need to recognize that the regulation part is here already. We've done this in cyber. It's been very difficult. We've done it in space. It remains very difficult. I'm very pleased, for example, this week that the UK introduced cyber safety limits on the Internet of Things, which is something I was working on about 10 years ago. Hey, it's a 10-year rule, I call it. It takes about 10 years. And I wanted to also address the threshold of conflict. I don't know if you want me to address that at this stage. So, I mean, I think that Ken's got a really good point. I think that there's a human cost associated with the use of any weapons. And if you look at these weapons as we imagine them to be, they're not there yet. But we imagine that the cost to the perpetrator in the moment would be low, and therefore it might lower the threshold of conflict. But I would say that the cost to those targeted is not clear to us that would be a lower cost. And that has an impact, obviously, on the perpetrator in terms of how they wish to wage war, how they wish to be seen in the international community, but also blowback. It will come back to them, right? One way or the other. There's no cost-free war here. And it's a false idea that you might be able to send out a weapon and have a cost-free experience of war. It will come back. And I think that what we're not seeing in the world, though, and this fills me with great sorrow and makes me realize that we really do need to tackle this in a much wider way than we are. We're not seeing an appetite for casualties diminish. We're not seeing that anywhere. We're not seeing targeted assassination appetite diminish at all. And so what I'm seeing is that the human cost in calculations, either the perpetrator's own human cost or the ones that are being targeted, is not the major factor. And the death and injury of civilian and combatants is so horrific and so huge these days. So I don't know if these will be the major factors that countries will take into account.